And just like that, Paul, we're live.
Great.
Good morning, sir. I got waiting for folks to jump on. I'd be remiss if I didn't advertise a little bit for the American Warrior Society. Here's the challenge coin of becoming a member of our self-preservation, self-defense community. If you want to take a free 14-day test drive of Mr. Mike Seekland and I, please click the links in today's show notes. You can learn everything from white belt to blue belt, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, gun grappling. We've got PCC. We're going to run a red dot on a handgun. We're going to teach you how to do that. Rifle, shotgun, less lethal. Got everything you need to keep you and your family safer in these really strange times we find ourselves in. Please check the links in today's show notes. Also, if you want to check out today's guest, Paul Martin, you can find him at paulmartin.com. Links in today's show notes as well. You want to pick up a couple of copies of Paul's books, I'm sure you can do that on his website as well. If you want to pick up a copy of No Safe Alternative, Improving How We Teach Cops to Kill by Dr. T.C. Fuller, retired FBI agent, you can do that in the links in today's show notes, or pick up a copy of On Violence and Varietals, Tales of Action from your old pal Rich Brown. We got John Shriver is on from Yukon, Oklahoma. He is coin number 1919. Derek Gibson is on from North Carolina. Paul, good morning, brother.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'll go ahead and read your bio, Paul. Our guest today is Paul Martin. Paul earned a degree in public policy studies from Vanderbilt University and a law degree from the University of Miami. He is admitted to practice law in Tennessee, Florida, and Texas. Paul currently works in the field of government relations. In September of 2015, Paul published Pivot Points, Creating a Culture of Preparedness and Resiliency in America. Paul examines the current state of the preparedness movement and suggests various strategies to inculcate a preparedness mindset into American culture. His first book, Bracing for Impact, a practical guide for preparing for a disaster, came out in 2011. Bracing for Impact provides law firms and small businesses with practical guidance on developing disaster plans to improve workplace safety and business continuity after a disaster. Paul currently resides in Austin with his wife, Kendall. Paul, thanks for coming on the show, man. Your background, I think you have a lot to offer our community, so I really appreciate you spending time with us this morning.
Thank you, sir. And on my website, it's Paul T. Martin. There's a T Tango in there, paultmartin.com, if you're interested in the book or my blog or anything else I talk about from time to time.
And you got a lot of really outstanding free resources, downloadable PDFs that are a lot of actionable information. I've taken advantage of some of that stuff, Paul.
Well, I created a lot of that simply because I would get questions on where to start in preparedness, or they would have a question about a specific topic. So it's really to help me when people ask questions, rather than having to type out a long email. I just send people a link or links to whatever topic they have questions about. So it's as much of a time saver for me as that it is a resource for other people. But I'm happy to put that stuff out there, and I hope it's of use to someone.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you doing that. Rudy is on, says, good morning, guys. Fast Group Tony says, good morning, folks. My good friend Michael Gentili is on from Boise. I want to start kind of with, I want to talk mostly, well, I would like to start off with your book, Pivot Points, Creating a Culture of Preparedness and Resilience in America. What is the book about? You know, who's your audience? What was the goal for writing the book? Take it wherever you like, Paul.
Yeah, I just started writing essays back in 2013, really just for myself, thinking about preparedness, because I've been blogging and preparing and doing presentations about preparedness since 2020, or excuse me, since 2000. And I just started these essays just really to help me get a better sense in my mind where the preparedness movement was going at that pivotal juncture. And when I started looking at some of the stuff I was putting together, I thought, you know, this might be an interesting book for people. And the book really is not about how to get prepared. I do devote one chapter in this book really telling people, if you need to start right now, here's a way to get started. But the book is about creating a culture of preparedness in America and in any other country for that matter. And I go through and I examine the different reasons people prepare. And that's the name. That's why the title is called Pivot Points. Finding your pivot point. What is it that makes you decide to flip that switch and become a prepared person, with the understanding that what motivates me might be different than what motivates you. And you know what? That's okay. Because in a lot of times in the preparedness community, don't see this much anymore, but it used to be that I would prepare for X. And if you weren't preparing for X, well, then you were preparing for the wrong reason and you're a moron. Well, we need to get away from that. And in many respects, we have. But we have to understand that everyone gets prepared for different reasons. Maybe I get prepared because I'm a parent and I've got two small kids and I'm worried about them. Maybe I'm getting prepared because my faith requires me to do it. Maybe I'm getting prepared because I've got elderly parents that are going to require me to be available for them in times of disaster, or I've got a job that requires me to be online in times of disaster. Whatever motivates you to get prepared, I'm all for you using that as your motivator to get prepared. And I go through and I explain a lot of these things, about creating culture preparedness. How do we go about doing that? What are some of the things that might motivate us to do that? How do we respond to a government that, what I find interesting about the government is you've got FEMA telling you have a kit, make a plan. And then you also have the FBI, not lately, but in the years past have said, if you see someone who is too prepared, let us know because they might be a terrorist. And so my question to them is, to the government, pick a lane. Because if I need, you're telling me to be prepared. One agency's telling me to be prepared. One agency's telling me, well, if I'm too prepared, then I'm going to have law enforcement agents knocking on my door. What is the correct answer? And this is part of the challenge I think we have in the preparedness community is navigating all of these different societal and government limitations and ideas about what preparedness looks like.
Now, Paul, you're a lobbyist. That's your day job. And what, if any, role did your job as a lobbyist, and you can talk about what you do if you like, have to do with you getting into this preparedness space?
Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap between, and I lobby for the insurance industry. And I don't know if there's overlap between lobbying and preparedness, but there certainly is with insurance and preparedness. Insurance is about having a policy in place so that if you have a bad day, if a storm comes, or if you have an emergency medical situation where you need health insurance, that there's some resource there to help you in times of need. So there's a lot of overlap, particularly in what we call property and casualty insurance. And in property and casualty insurance is simply auto and homeowners is the best way to think about that. And there's a lot of overlap there because we're always telling people in the insurance space, you really need to think about having, making sure you have fire extinguishers, smoke alarms, making sure that your roof is in good shape, making sure that you're doing fire drills, all those kind of good citizen type things. So when there are disasters, it's up to the insurance industry to go in immediately after the disaster, assess the situation, and start writing those checks to help people recover from their unexpected. So there's a lot of overlap. And so basically I spend much of my day reading stories about disasters, which is kind of nice because as a prepper, I would be doing that anyway. And now I've got someone who pays me to do it. And so it's kind of a win on both sides for me.
Yeah, I like it. As I mentioned before, and I mentioned to you when we first connected, I left the Marine Corps after 23 years. I'd been a police officer and stuff, and then I got into the American Red Cross as a paid staff member, managed the disaster relief operations on different things, and then but my blue sky job was disaster preparedness and government operations. So we've stomped in some of the same mud puddles. And I love what you said a moment ago. You said insurance companies writing checks. Well, if you don't know this, that's what FEMA does. That's what TEMA does. That's what the Red Cross does. Everybody wants to write a check and have you sign a document and then walk away. So whether you're prepared or whether you're going to have to rebuild your life after a disaster, I mean, it's going to be on you. So you might as well be resilient and prepared from the get-go. This idea that FEMA is going to come in and show up with a truck and hammer and nails and build your house back is just absolutely not going to happen. FEMA's role, and loosely stated, is basically continuity of government, continuity of operations in a national disaster. It has nothing to do with rebuilding Rich and Paul's life. Am I correct in saying that, Paul?
That's right. And what we tell people is if you're waiting on FEMA to make you whole, to help you recover versus having a homeowner's policy, you're going to be sorely disappointed at the end of the day because the delta between what you get from an insurance company and what you get from FEMA is, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I understand that people don't like paying for insurance. I don't like paying for insurance either. I'd rather spend that money on other things. But one of the things I'm fond of telling people is if your preparedness efforts are boring, it probably means you're doing it right. And a big part of being a prepared citizen is making sure you have the right insurance coverage, making sure that your preventative maintenance is done on your vehicles, that you're changing out the batteries in your smoke alarms in your house, that you're doing all these tedious, boring, not fun things. But at the end of the day, that's the sort of thing that is required. So another example is, we have in Texas, we have these power outages. We've had these power outages for the last 2 or 3 years. And a lot of us have standby generators for our homes. I have friends who have them who say, well, I don't pay the service people to come out and check it twice a year because that's just money I feel like I'm wasting. It's $300, $400 a year, $1 a day, more or less, to make sure that your generator works when it needs it. And then when the big event hits, all of a sudden they would be willing to pay, 10x that
Oh
to
yeah.
have some to make sure their generator works. And so, part of it is just, being a responsible adult, being a good steward of what you have and making sure that everything works so that, in that time of crisis, because we don't get to pick the time or place when something bad happens to us, generally, that everything works, our systems work, our plans work, so that we can be a resource to our family and to our neighbors in times of need.
Yeah, you mentioned boring. I had a podcast with a good friend of mine, worked for some 3-letter agencies, and was in this Marine Corps Special Operations community. It was called Across the Peak. And the first book we put out, the only book we put out together, was a automobile preventive maintenance guidebook. And again, like you said, Paul, you're so right. It's absolutely boring stuff. Get out there and check the oil, get out there and check the tire pressures, get out there and check the windshield wipers. And if you do all these things, then your life is pretty predictable and boring. But that's the kind of life I want to live. I don't like catastrophizing. Uh, let's talk about preparedness, because I think that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What does it mean to you, Paul?
So preparedness to me means being able to continue with mission critical activities, irrespective of the circumstances around me. So for the typical suburban family, if your power goes out and your kids need to be able to go to school, your kids need to be able to do their homework when they come home at night, they need to be able to eat, they need to be able to bathe. For those of us like me who work from home, we still need to be able to make a living. Being able to continue on with our daily affairs in facing whatever circumstance, be it a power outage, be it a heat wave, cold wave, whatever civil disruption, whatever the case may be, being able to continue to function, and in my case, being able to be a resource to your friends, to your neighbors, to your employer, to your churches, to the civic organizations that you participate in. That's where I think prepared people really shine, is when they can be a resource to other people. And that's what preparedness does. It puts you in a position to help others and to be a leader in your community, in your neighborhood, in your employers, in your employment, when times are bad.
Yeah, absolutely. As a disaster preparedness trainer, I went to a lot of churches on weekends and nights and stuff like that, whenever the congregation could meet with me. And we talked about sheltering, food and water and stuff like that. And I want to kind of walk down that ladder. Food, water, cash, health and sanitation, energy, lighting, security, communications. Any one of those, Paul, that you want to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive on, things that people maybe don't consider when they're putting a preparedness plan together?
Yeah, we'll talk about a couple of them. On my website, if you go to the very top of the website, there's a banner that says "Click here for the Ready Citizen Guide." That's what you were talking. One of those resources you were talking about. It's a PDF. You can download it. It's about 50 pages long. And I created this because I had so many people say, "I want to get prepared, but I feel so overwhelmed at where to start and how to get started and what I should be doing," because there's a fear of, I'm going to buy the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and I don't want to do that. So I created this guide that if you go through the steps, you can get and achieve a baseline level of preparedness in pretty short order. One of the things I spend a fair amount of time talking about is food, because that's one I get a lot of questions about. And, I know there are a lot of vendors out there who sell a year's supply. It's freeze-dried this, it's space food, it's freeze-dried sea monkey soup. There's no such thing as sea monkey soup. That's just my example of what I talk about. And I say, you really don't have to have all that fancy, expensive freeze-dried stuff. You can get prepared in short order, pretty much with things at your grocery store. And I go through the math and I show you that where you get your protein and where you get your calories, and find things, and we identify things in the manual that store simply and store well without any essential work. Things like rice and spaghetti and peanut butter, and all sorts of things that in canned meats, things where you can get your essential elements, your essential proteins, nutrition that you can get from your grocery store that you don't have to spend an exorbitant amount of money to buy. In fact, there's a spreadsheet on my website on that in that Ready Citizen manual where I use data. I update the data once a year. Another update will be coming out in July, whereby it will tell you how much this costs. And I tell you give me how many weeks you want to be prepared for, how many people are you preparing for. You input that number into the spreadsheet, and it tells you how many calories and how much protein you need for that period of time. And then it gives you a whole list of various food items, and then you can go in and program the numbers in and figure out what that's going to cost you. So I've tried to do as much as I possibly can to make this easy for people. Food is the one I get the most questions about. Water is becoming a more popular topic at the moment, in large part because I've spent a lot of time in the last year talking about water purification and building your own water purification system with just stuff off the shelf from Amazon and Home Depot. The big lesson there is you're better off storing the water than you are collecting and purifying it, because that's hard work, and it can be kind of hit or miss. So water and food are obviously the two big ones. And then I tell the people the most overlooked, I believe, is sanitation, because I've had so many people tell me who've guys like you who've been overseas, either in a combat situation or a humanitarian situation where the real disaster is the illness that comes, the waterborne, the foodborne illnesses that come. Friends of mine were doing some disaster relief in Houston after Hurricane Harvey, and they were on airboats, and they would come back to Austin and they'd say, the doctors that we were working with put us on Cipro when we came back. I said, well, what were you doing that you needed ciprofloxacin, antibiotic? I said, what were you doing that you need antibiotic for? And they say, well, we're on those airboats, right? And the water's going everywhere. And basically what they say, it's aerosolized poo vapor, because sewage was getting into the water. And when those airboats would churn up that water, people were breathing in this water that had raw sewage, untreated sewage in it. So they were putting us on antibiotics to treat for that. This is in Houston, Texas. This is not in some third world country, right? And so that's what people realize. I think don't put enough emphasis on is that when the grid crashes and you have a large power outage or you can't flush your toilets or whatever, that a simple cut, or just breathing in water or vapor or whatever, things we just take for granted when everything's working, that can create a real emergency, especially when first responders may be tied up and hospitals may be tied up and you can't get there in time or they can't see you in time.
Yeah, I want to take on several things you just said. I love the way that you approach food and the caloric tables and stuff that you use. So I highly recommend that. But I as I wrote these notes, you and I were passing them back and forth. I said, I really want to talk about this health and sanitation. Grossly overlooked. I remember in combat, as soon as it stopped, there's dead bodies everywhere. I mean, it's just what happens. And flies are on them. And I'm a kid at the time. I think I'm 20, just turned 21. And okay, the flies are eating the dead bodies and stuff. I mean, it's combat. It's what it is. And each battalion has a medical doctor assigned to it. It's like, we got to get these bodies in the ground. We're going to have cholera. We're going to have all this stuff. The same flies on the bodies landing on your food and I'm like, I never would have thought that. So one of the first order of business is to get these bodies deep in the ground so you won't get sick. And then in the same thing with the Red Cross, I would be in charge of a large number of shelters. We've got some amazing nurses and doctors, and they're doing amazing things. And I'm like, what can I give you? What can I do for you? And 99% of the time, we need all the health, all the bleach and the Lysol wipes and the sprays that we can get because we'd have a neuro outbreak or something. And my brother talked about, I don't know if Jeff is on this morning, but he talked a lot about, he did a lot of time at Haiti with the military. And he's like, that aerolized fecal particles is a real thing. And you can get deathly ill quickly over there if you're not prepared.
Yeah. And one of the things that I like to point out to people, and I appreciate you bringing the comment about bleach and bleach wipes, is here in Austin, during the big winter storm we had a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and the water system shut down for the city of Austin. And many people did not have access to water. They were issuing boil water orders. Well, if you didn't have electricity, unless you had gas stove, you couldn't boil water. People were struggling to come up with how to purify water, and they don't have bleach. Or the people during the pandemic couldn't find bleach wipes. Meanwhile, so many of them had swimming pools and had huge buckets of a substance called calcium hypochlorite, pool shock. Guess what? If you know the formula, you can make bleach with pool shock. And that's one of the things I go through in this manual, is that while bleach is okay, and bleach is very convenient, and I have bleach, calcium hypochlorite, pool shock, stores so much better and is so much cheaper than bleach. With a package of, just a standard 1 pound bag of pool shock, you can make countless gallons of bleach with that. And just knowing a few just MacGyver hacks like that.
That is huge. And
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Paul, because again, sitting in those FEMA and TEMA meetings when it was during the Ebola outbreak when I was with the Red Cross, and Ebola had finally reached American shores. And I think down in Dallas, we had a guy come in, and I think 2 nurses got Ebola, and it was kind of touch and go whether it's going to spread. So we brought these doctors in who'd been dealing with it into our conferences, and they just was like, hey, bleach is the thing, put them in garden sprayers. We're hosing everything down. And they were going through their really ramshackle protocols in the Congo, and like, hey, it worked. You should see these body handlers, and they're wearing makeshift stuff, for PPE. Like, yeah, none of them got Ebola just because of bleach. So when COVID first popped on my radar, we had just come back from Europe, and they were talking about what's going on in China over there. When I got back to the States in early February, I'm like, nobody's talking about what's going on in China, this COVID thing that might be coming over here. So we were ahead of the power curve here in my family. And I told Lisa, like, get a bunch of bleach. As soon as it came in, I wrote dates on a Sharpie, because the efficacy of bleach is only about 6 months, right? Correct. But guess what? That pool shock you talked about, Paul, is much longer than 6 months.
It is. And you have to store it correctly. And we all have stories. I have stories of where you don't store it correctly and you leave it in your closet in your garage. And next thing you know, you got corrosion of all sorts of things because I didn't have it stored correctly. And so the thing I tell people is, if you're going to buy pool shock, get the bucket that it comes in. And so I went to my pool supply place and I said, I need a bucket where you sell this stuff. And they said, we don't sell the buckets, but we just threw a bunch of them away. They're in the dumpster behind the store. Feel free to do that. So I went dumpster diving, and I'm pulling out pool shock buckets, right? Because and they work great because they're airtight. And you don't have to use a pool shock bucket. You just have to store it some way that's airtight. But these are the lessons that I learned. And I tell people I've made every mistake in preparedness at least twice. And I try to share some of that stuff in my blog so that people don't make those same mistakes as well. But that's the sort of thing that we all just need to be a bit more cognizant of resources that are commonly available and how to use them and how to deploy them in times of disaster.
Yeah. And speaking of, you mentioned freeze-dried food. If you do want to do that, if weight is an issue, if you want to get long-term stored food, 25 years-ish, Tony is on this morning. Tony, put a link. He is a freeze-dried food provider. So, Tony, if you would put a link to your company there. Tony says, in regards to food store, what you and your family will actually enjoy eating, plain rice and beans will get old quick. Yes, that is correct. Rudy says, do you have thoughts on whether there are other chemicals in pool shock that may not be good to digest?
Yeah, pretty much anything in pool shock is not good to digest. So what I talk about in my blog, when I talk about water purification, is lots of different ways to approach it. Pool shock bleach are great because they're very effective, but they're also easy to remove from the water. So what I tell people is you want to treat the water with the chlorine, the pool shock, the bleach, whatever it is you're using. And then you want to, unless you're doing really small amounts of that, you really want to get that chemical out of the water. So it's important to not only treat the water with a chemical, but it's also important to filter the water afterwards to get that stuff out. So there's lots of different ways to approach water purification. Much of it's a function of, do you have electricity? And do you have bleach? And what sort of equipment do you have to do it? And I tell people it's more important now to come up with ways to purify and filter water. That some that require electricity, some that do not. There are ways to purify water that don't use bleach at all, and they're very effective. But that's the challenge, is because we don't always know what situation we're going to be in. We don't know if we're going to have power. We don't know if we're necessarily going to have water filters. We may have water filters for a while, and then maybe we run out of water filters because we've burned them all up because they clogged up because we've been purifying really skunky water. So the thing to make sure is come up with multiple ways to purify water, because you're right. You really don't want to be drinking water with high levels of chlorine.
Yeah, and chlorine does nothing to remove metals from the water. There's some other things. So depending on what kind of disaster you find yourself in, if you live by a nuclear plant and there's runoff of that, chlorine is not going to do anything for that.
Yeah, I talk about crud, cooties, and chemicals, the 3 C's. You got to get
Exactly.
the chemicals out, the crud. The crud's the stuff you can see in the water, and then the cooties, the pathogens, the virus, the bacteria, all those things out of there. And whatever method you use, you just have to make sure you can treat for the 3 C's, whether you're shocking with chlorine, whether you're filtering it, whether you're treating with a UV light. Lots of different ways to approach that.
Yeah, and Tony's website's fastgroupfoods.com. Let's welcome some other folks onto the show. We got Gregory on up there in Rhode Island. Will is on from Missouri. Dr. Gordon Botson is on up there in Ohio. His code number 1688. We've got Johnny King from Kentucky. Don Bothwell out in Montana. Johnny King is on. Let's see. We have Ted says he's coin number 1461. Wannabe prepper, testing age of beans and buckets. Any thoughts on that?
So, yes, I think someone commented about how beans and rice can get boring. Sure, absolutely. But remember, this we ain't eating an Outback and Chili's during our crisis. This is to keep us alive. So a couple of things I would mention about food. One, I have freeze-dried food. I'm not opposed to freeze-dried food. It solves a lot of problems, right? You pour in some hot water and voila, you've got great tasting food. So there's a place for that in your plans. But the book I recommend for people to get is a book called The Storm Gourmet. You can buy it on Amazon. It's like $15. It was written by the author or the editor of Palm Beach Illustrated, someone who's a real foodie. And she shows you using what shelf-stable stuff that doesn't need refrigeration, that you can keep on hand to make all these foods, this prepper food, taste a lot better. My wife is not a prepper. She's what I call prepper tolerant. She puts up with my preparedness, although over the years I've been seen it's been determined that I've been right about some of this stuff, which is good for my marriage. But she is a foodie, and she looks at this book, The Storm Gourmet, this cookbook, and she says, this is actually really good stuff. And I've made some of the stuff for her using shelf-stable stuff, rice, beans, canned chicken. And next thing you know, you're creating gourmet-level food with just staples. And so having just a cookbook, just something really simple on hand, can really make those meals that would otherwise be really boring, can make those meals really good.
Hey, it's absolutely. In my butt pack when I was in the infantry, I had Texas Pete and Crazy Jane's mixed up salt. Just those two things could really put some spice into ordinary crappy MREs. I got some comments here. 52 Violent Tactics, Knowledge, and Concepts. My good friend Ken is on up there in Binghamton, New York. Says, good morning, gents. William Hollenbeck is on. Good morning. Chuck Renfo is joining us. Matt Sims says, good morning. Will says, my mom's family's from Louisiana, so rice and beans are normal, LOL. Yeah. I want to go back to the list: food, water, cash, health, and sanitation. We talked a lot about that. Energy and lighting. I think some of this will food, water, everybody gets that, right? Health and sanitation, we talked about that. Let's talk about cash. Let's talk about communications, energy, security, those kind of things.
So there was a rap group a while back called Wu-Tang Clan. They're still out there. That has a rap called Cream. Cash rules everything around me. Mm-hmm. And I use that as part of my presentation when I talk about this. Because everyone says, we can't use cash. You should get gold and silver and Bitcoin. There's a place for those things. But at the end of the day, you still need cash because maybe the credit card systems are down. Maybe the power's still up, but the credit card systems are down. The ATMs are out without cash for whatever reason. Having cash solves problems. And I tell people, look at cash as a tool to solve problems. Sometimes the correct answer to the problem is throw money at it. If you need cash to buy gasoline and they're taking cash, they're not taking your credit card or your debit card, the people who have cash are the ones who are going to be able to thrive. And the story I tell is at my local grocery store, pre-pandemic, on a Friday afternoon in the summer, no bad weather, no hurricane, everything is functional. But for whatever reason, the credit card readers in that grocery store on that Friday afternoon went down and you could only use cash. That was a really good experiment in watching how thin of the veneer of society really is, because there were a lot of really upset people who were normally very pleasant, normal, likable people. People got upset simply because that grocery store's credit card readers and debit card readers went down. And those of us who had cash, people looked at us with some resentment. The fact that we were like special citizens because we could like whip out 40, 50, 60 bucks and pay for our groceries, and they couldn't. And so cash is a tool. And people ask me, well, how much money should I have on hand? It's a good question. And I used to tell people $100 per day per person in your home per week. With inflation, that number is probably higher. But remember, you're only going to be using this for the absolute essentials. If you have gas, if you have food stored, if you have water stored, if you have medications, both over-the-counter prescriptions, hopefully you're not going to need to spend a lot of money. But having cash on hand will enable you, when things go down, will enable you to solve some problems.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And having traveled extensively abroad, I mean, heck, I don't know, probably 6 months before COVID, we flew into Rome, my wife and I, and I'm like, let's get out some money, just in case. Like, well, we're in a first world country. And anyway, I took out, I don't know, $500 worth of cash. The first 3 places we went to, none of the credit card readers worked, and cash was king, and we were able to keep moving. So cash is absolutely king, especially as Johnny King points out, with the increase in cyber attacks, cash is king, guys.
Absolutely.
And I love your point, Paul, that Bitcoin and precious metals, they have a place, but diversification, whether it's in the blue skies or the gray sky events, it's still, you still got to have cash.
That's right. I mean, my grocery store is yet to figure out a way for me to plug in a USB to give them some Bitcoin. All right. I mean, that's the thing, is that if it's a cyber attack, your credit cards, your debit cards, they ain't gonna work, right?
No.
And so you're left with cash, and then anything you can convert gold and silver to cash, which you could probably do, but it may be harder. Just having the cash on hand solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, Don says, as a retired financial advisor, I used to tell my clients to have at least 3 months worth of expenses in cash at home, if and only if they had a means to protect it from fire and theft. Well said, sir. I want to get to, this community, the American Warrior Society, we're all about guns and gear. So I'm going to kind of skip security and things of that nature, because I think we always overdo it there. That stuff solves a very, very, very small problem, but communications, let's talk about that one, because I'm going to be completely frank with you. This is something that Rich Brown's personal communication. Yes, I have some ham radios. Yes, I have some of that stuff. Am I good with it? I would give myself a failing grade, Paul. What do we need to know when it comes to communications for preparedness?
So yeah, and this is something I'm continuing to work on, and I say that as someone who's a general licensed ham radio operator. I've got the HF radios, I've got the HT, the handheld radios, I've got all that stuff. I will not tell you I'm an expert in it, but I'm actually spending more time now dealing with that, and I deal with it in large part because my day job requires me to travel so much, and my fear is something will happen when I'm on the road and I need to get in touch with family back home. So one of the things I've been exploring is, one, having more the small walkie-talkie type radios. You got the Family Radio Service, FRS, and you have GMRS, excuse me, which does require a license, but it's one of those deals where you pay a fee to the federal government for $35. You need a license for 10 years. Those radios have a lot of potential. You can buy those on Amazon. One thing I carry with me when I travel is a Garmin product. It's called an InReach. I've got an older one, but they make newer ones now. You can buy them on Amazon for about $300, I think. That uses satellites, GPS satellites, and you can send text messages to anyone who has a working cell phone. So I carry that with me when I travel out of town, because I may be needing to send a message back home if the grid is down where I am, but hopefully the grid is still up here at the house. So there's lots of challenges that people need to be thinking about, of how am I going to stay in touch with my family? How am I going to stay in touch with my neighbors? Particularly if we have a regional power outage and maybe cell phones go down and I need to call for help. How do I get in touch with my neighbors on a 24/7 basis? And those walkie-talkies, particularly those GMRS radios, can be really helpful. And just having basic phone numbers available. And, we've gotten so mentally lazy, and I'm guilty of this, of having phone numbers in your phone, but you don't have them memorized, right? So, and if your phone doesn't work, then if you got to a phone, how would you call someone? So having just a card in your wallet or purse telling you, giving you basic phone information. And finally, something that has just really come out in the last couple of weeks in my preparedness think tank group is, we've all been ditching our landlines, right? Because they're expensive and your cell phone works so much better in many respects. The reality is now we're starting to see situations where really sophisticated gangs that are doing home invasions are using radio frequency jammers and jamming your Wi-Fi and jamming your cell phone before they raid your house. I did a blog post about this last week. Kim Commando, who does a syndicated radio show about tech and computers and these things, that happened to her at her house. They had some gangs had thrown a jammer in her backyard and shut down all of her Wi-Fi, shut down some of her cameras. But she was smart enough. This is a tech person. She still had a landline, and her cameras, her security cameras, were all hardwired. When you build a house now, if you tell them you want you want a landline and you want hardwired cameras, they're going to look at you like you're nuts, because we're supposed to be on Ring, we're supposed to be on Blink, we're supposed to be using all this technology. Well, then guess what? The bad guys have figured that out, and now they have figured out a relatively inexpensive way to basically knock you completely offline, so they can come into your house and do whatever they want. And it's terrifying. And so one of the things my preparedness think tank group, we've been starting to war game this out. What would you do if someone came in your house, the next thing you know, your cell phone doesn't work because the signal's being jammed, and your Wi-Fi doesn't work, and therefore maybe your security system and your cameras don't work? What's our solution to that problem? And the people who are kicking it old school with wired cameras and landline phones, right now they've got an advantage over some of us.
No, 100%. And during the GWAT, we learned this a lot. You're rolling down the road and you're getting hit by IEDs every single day. So the convoys are rolling with the jammers, stop the cell phones. Well, then they'd start doing command detonated mines. But the Roden murders really drew my attention. I think it was 9 members of the Roden family were murdered up in Ohio, maybe at 3 or 4 different locations. And that's exactly how they were able to go in, and they jammed before they made entry, and then they were able to kill everybody and get away without anybody being able to call 911. So that's a real fear that when I was a police officer wasn't there. Everybody had landlines. But guess what? The scumbags that did home invasions would cut the landline before they made entry to the house. So security, we can do other shows on security, but I think that the discussions around that, comms and things of this nature, are incredibly important. And one of the things you brought up, Paul, is that you travel a lot from home. I do too, and most people that will listen to this podcast do as well. The distances that we're talking about here, if the grid goes down, if there is an EMP, coronal mass ejection, something like that knocks out our grid, and you're stranded. If I'm just stranded in town, Paul, I live 20 minutes car drive into town here in rural Tennessee. That's a day's walk. I mean, that's an all day 8-hour event just to walk home. So having some cash to go into Walmart and buy that BMX bicycle and pedal my ass home might be an option, but you have to have cash to do that.
Cash solves problems. And, my fear is I'm not 20 minutes from home or 20 miles from home. I'm 200 miles or 2,000 miles
Correct.
From home. So one of the things I've started doing, it sounds nuts, but before I get ready to go on a trip, I'll go on Auto Trader and I'll identify 3 or 4 pickup trucks available, used pickup trucks available for sale. Make sure I've got enough gold and cash on me to buy one of those. And the plan is to go buy a vehicle if I need to and drive myself home and have enough cash that I can put some gas tanks in the 5-gallon gas tanks in the back of the truck, buy some gasoline, and basically turn that thing into a rolling gas station and try to get home. It's not pleasant to think about. And I mean, it truly is the thing that concerns me the most, because, and I've told my family, is that in that scenario, there's a pretty decent chance I'm not coming home, particularly if the grid's going to be down for, weeks or months. The odds that I will get home may be pretty slim. And so I tell people, if you're going to do that, it is so imperative that you beat the herd out of town, that you've got to get on the road and got to get moving. You can't just sit and wait. And because things will really start to deteriorate. You want to be on the road and moving and heading home faster than anybody else. Absolutely.
Tony says, where do I get one of those jammers? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of guys I follow on Twitter that I would recommend, that they're doing some really pioneering work. One is Don Shift. He's written some books on this subject. In fact, I got another book of his came in yesterday on using drones for making sure for surveillance in your neighborhood during a crisis. There's another guy, NC Scout, North Carolina Scout, on Twitter, who's doing a lot of good work on this. He's written some books on using the Baofeng ham radios. I've had Baofengs, and I've just bought some new ones. I've had them in the past. I usually tell people Baofeng is Mandarin for should have bought a Yaesu, because I find the Baofengs in the past have just been unreliable crap. But now enough people are using these radios that we're getting better at figuring out how to utilize them in a crisis. And so Don Shift, NC Scout, check them out on Twitter. They've written some books. If you're inclined, get some of their stuff. They're the ones doing the real pioneering work, I think, on communications during a crisis.
I love that you mentioned drones too. If you don't have I have a little Maverick Mini, fantastic, $300 or $400, and I can zoom down the road and see what, if anything, is down there waiting for me. I think that's a show I probably need to do, is how I set my truck up. Having been in disasters, especially winter weather disasters, the trees are going to be down across the road. Power lines are going to be down across the road. How do you navigate through that? It is a real challenge. Paul, I want to talk about this is where I think a lot of people don't understand. In the Red Cross, we used to say all disasters are local. And that's true, meaning that it means something else to the Red Cross, but this is the way I was interpreted. I can get out of the disaster. And a lot of times, like the disasters going on here in these 4 counties, Putnam County, Fentress County, White County, et cetera, I can drive to Carthage and be fine, stay in a hotel room, eat a nice meal, and then come back to do my work the next day in the disaster area. The problem is when the disaster isn't local, the disaster is coast to coast.
Right.
Everybody's involved. What, if any, thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, the regional disasters, it doesn't even have to be coast to coast. We had that here in Texas in February 21, where we had a period of time where 2/3 of the state did not have power, and it was 10 degrees outside. We're not in Texas. We're not used to that unless you're up in the Panhandle, and we're certainly not used to being without power for days on end. This is the real scenario that people need to be prepared for. And the thing is, I tell people is if you're waiting on FEMA and TEMA and all these other alphabet organizations, and I'm not being critical of that, because disaster recovery work is so challenging because you're going into an area that has more or less no infrastructure, and you're trying to help as many people as you can. But if that is your plan, is to rely on those organizations, you're going to be sorely disappointed in the level of care that you get. And so that's why it is so imperative, because we live in a world now that cyber attacks that could affect regions, that's a thing. That's a real thing. I encourage your audience to read Ted Koppel's book. I think it's called Lights Out. He wrote it several years ago.
Fantastic book.
And to hear, and Ted Koppel's the last is not a tinfoil hat, buy a bunch of guns, run for the hills kind of guy. And to read Ted Koppel talk about, after my research, I bought a year's supply of food for all of my family. I mean, when people like that, and then you've got all these people building the billionaires building the bunkers and everything, why are they doing this? What is it they know that we don't know? And I mean, we live in a world now that is becoming more dangerous and becoming more uncertain. And so it's so imperative just for the well-being of ourselves and our family that we take basic steps so that we can ride out those troughs of society, of our history, that are bad times, and get ready for whatever's coming next.
No, I 100% agree. That book is outstanding. It was recommended to me by another member, who was in a 3-letter agency, and I read it, just blew my hair back. I thought it was
it's shocking. And again, it's because it's who's writing the book, and the access of the people he was able to interview for that. And you quickly learn that a lot of these folks who are in charge, they really don't have a plan. I call it the nebulous they.
Yes.
People say, well, they are saying, or they will fix it, or when will they get around to fixing it? There is no they.
Right.
I mean, if to the extent there is a they, it's going to be a slow process. So you got to start thinking in terms of, what can I do to make things more normal for my family, so that we can get through this, and that I can be a resource to others in times of crisis.
Let's talk about that because you alluded to it a second ago, Paul, and I really want to hammer this home. What I've seen in disaster relief operations is you don't want to be a drain on the system because the system is already going to be maxed out. And I'll tell you just a quick vignette. All the sick and affirm folks that are in your community that rely on Meals on Wheels and things of this nature,
Yeah,
that's all they have the resources to handle. And they are going to disrupt everything. As I saw, it's like, well, this lady's been waiting on an ambulance for 25 hours just to get her moved from her home to the house, and she weighs 400 pounds. It's going to take multiple medics, and she's on oxygen and dialysis and da-da-da-da-da. And then trying to get, this is another thing I always thought was crazy. When somebody shows up, these people aren't the brightest folks in the world, so they don't show up to the shelter with their medication. So then it's like, I've got to try to figure out, me and the nurses and folks, how do we get this person the stuff from a pharmacy, because the pharmacies are closed. You don't want to be in that position.
that's right.
Trust me, that it's unbelievable. And the thing about communications is, the first disaster relief operation I worked, my boss was like, hey, Rich, why don't you get all the emergency management agency directors on a phone call together? I think that'd be helpful for them. And I got them all on the call, and it was bedlam. They're like, for some reason, your 911 calls for Cumberland County are going to White County. And they're like, my calls are going there. I wonder why the phones weren't ringing here. And I'm like, what in the hell, guys? I mean, they weren't talking to each other. If it hadn't been for me to put them all on a phone call together, and that was once the cell services come back up.
Yeah.
So it's bedlam, folks. You think that, these adults are going to figure it out, guys. It's the government. And let's leave it at that.
No, that's very true. I mean, people think that that there's going to be some, emergency response team, SWAT team's going to roll in and fix all the things and get us back to normal. Not happening.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that you can be prepared, so you're not a drain on the system, and so that maybe you can go do a shift on Meals on Wheels.
Yes.
And you can deliver the aid. That was one of the things I learned in the pandemic, was they were looking for people to help with Meals on Wheels. And I thought, that's a great idea. I can do that. And so I went on the website, and they're like, well, the problem is that you haven't been onboarded. You haven't gone through training, and it's the pandemic and we're locked down. So we're not doing any training anymore right now because we're in lockdown. So it was just, they had just not thought their way through it. Now, to the local Meals on Wheels credit, you now do all that online. Yeah. So you can get trained online on how to do it and immediately get qualified to go do that. But that was one of the things that they've never really thought of how do we onboard a lot of people really quickly if they can't come in and be physically present. So that's one of the things we have to think about. And we learned in the pandemic. We got a lot of lessons out of the pandemic. I hope that we don't lose those lessons anytime soon, because we may very well need them in the months and years ahead.
No, that's very true. And I want to go back to this idea that all disaster is local. And when you have a regional or nationwide disaster, which is what a cyber attack, CME, EMP, etc. Because here's my thing. We would fly in disaster relief workers because we've got guys that have a specialty in Houston, guys that have a specialty that live in Portland, Oregon. They've been managing disaster assistance teams, and I need them to fly in, get in our emergency operations center, and then start putting their stuff together and get out on the ground. But guys, when all that stuff breaks down, they're not able to fly in and help.
I was going to ask you, how long did that take just to get those people, those experts there on the ground, and get them ready to start serving your community?
Close to a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
7 days. So for the first 7 days, you're it. You're on your own.
Yeah. And that's if everything works swimmingly, because we have to, if you think about it logistically, they fly into BNA there in Nashville. We got to have buses there to pick them up. We got to have hotel rooms set up for them. We got to onboard them at the site, get them, because they've never been to Tennessee before, or Texas or Oklahoma, maybe their first time on the ground. So there's all this stuff that has to happen behind the scenes. And meanwhile, you're sitting at your house like, well, how come nobody's got here yet? What are they going to do about this? Like, guys, they're coming. The cavalry's coming, but you got to be resilient enough in the interim to take care of yourself and your family.
That's exactly right.
Talk about resiliency, Paul.
Yeah. I think we just had a good discussion about that. And that is when the system goes down, whatever the disaster is, Maybe it's man-made. Maybe it's that coronal mass ejection you talked about.
Mhm.
Irrespective of what it is, it's going to be a while before normalcy is restored. And even when normalcy is restored, it may not look like the normalcy you had before the event. So to the extent that we can all be better prepared to manage and do those mission critical things in our lives, and and for the typical civilian, a mission critical thing is just being able to get up and go to work in the morning, to be able to get your kids off to school, to be able to cook a meal for your kids when they come home from school, to have some emergency lighting so they can do their homework after that. That to me, that's what resiliency looks like, is the ability to continue on irrespective of what's going on around you.
Yeah, I've talked about this before. No one, the disasters I've worked, no one starved to death. People got sick because they drank bad water. People got sick because we crammed a bunch of people in the shelter and they were packed on top of each other like animals. Poor sanitation, poor food, sanitation. I'm just talking about things that, especially when you talk about morbidity, the things that killed folks in disaster from my anecdotal experience was more often than not an elderly folks. They've got the generator, but they put it too close to the house and they die of carbon monoxide poisoning. We had, and I've talked about this before on the show, and it's just so damn tragic to me. Power goes out, young woman and her baby. She's a single mother. She's living in a trailer here in Tennessee, and her and her baby succumbed to the cold overnight and they're dead, because they didn't have a means to heat their home. So these things are real. Food and water is great, and you need to have that. But think about the things, how are you going to keep, whether you live in Texas and the temperature is a threat to your life, or maybe someone in your home that's more firm, whether it's an infant or the elderly. Do you have medication? This is another key thing, especially those, a lot of us, mine and your age, Paul, we have parents that are aging and things of this nature. You need to take special consideration for them, for your pets, for your animals. Once you start pulling on this preparedness thread, it takes you in a lot of different directions, doesn't it?
It really does. And that's a good point, because at some point for a lot of people, it really becomes overwhelming the more you pull on that thread. When you start to play what if, and you really start to go down those rabbit holes talking about it's not just food and water, it's also power, it's also heat, it's also cooling. People become overwhelmed. That's my experience, is that I can't figure this out. It's just too hard. It's too depressing. It bothers me. I can't sleep at night when I start thinking about this stuff. And so that was one of the reasons I created so much material on my website that I have, is if you'll just start now and you'll start just taking those steps, get your food situation taken care of, then move on to water, then move on to sanitation, then move on to cash, whatever order you want to take, but start doing something, right? And so and you may not be able to solve all your problems, but if you solve most of them, then you are less of a burden on the system when those emergency rescuers from out of state come in, but also you improve your odds dramatically of being able to endure the situation.
Well said. Absolutely well said. Paul, what is the state of our country at the moment, sir?
Well, I do politics for a living as part of my lobbyist job. And so I tend to look at things probably a little differently because I'm up to my neck in polling data and talking to state legislators and state regulators. Where I would say we are now is we have become more tribal in our politics. We used to use professional and collegiate sports for this, but now so many people derive their happiness or let their happiness be derived based upon whether their preferred candidate is in the White House. And it is not a good place for us to be, right? Because it becomes so tribal, and that we pick our friends based on what candidate they support. And that's just not, it is a society, as a free society, as a Republican form, small r Republican form of government, that's just really not healthy. And until we are willing as a society to disengage from that and chart a new course, we're going to continue in sort of this holding pattern, just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I think long term, at some point, we come out of this. I think we have to. I think there has to be a reset. I don't know what that reset looks like. That reset could be where calmer minds and cooler heads prevail, and we really start to rethink how we approach self-governance. But if we're going to continue down this road of these campus protests, the protests we saw in 2020, it's not healthy as a society to have violent protests and to cordon people off and put everybody in a group of, I'm friends with these people because I like the bumper stickers on their car, and I don't like these people over here because they have the wrong bumper sticker on their car. It's not healthy as a society, and that's a big concern I have. I know there's lots of talk of civil war, another civil war. In fact, I subscribe to Rasmussen Polling. I got an email from them yesterday. They had done some polling on what their attitudes were in terms of a likelihood of a second American Civil War. It's shocking. I mean, the number of people who think, yeah, we could have another Civil War in the next 5 years, and they break it down along party lines. And guess what? There's not much difference between Democrats and Republicans. There's not a lot of difference when you break it along gender lines. There's not a lot of difference when you break it along racial lines. You've got a lot of people who are genuinely upset for whatever reason, and they think this is coming. So, as for this community, for your community here, the people who listen to these broadcasts, I mean, what is our response to that, right? As I'll call it collectively the gun community. I am a member of the gun community, because so many times I think there are a lot of people out there who say, well, we just need to have more guns and ammo, and that solves everything. When I read books from guys like Clay Martin and John Mosby, when I read their stuff, and folks like you who've seen combat, what I get, and as someone who's never been in the military, what I gather is it's guys like them and you are the last people to engage in violent conflict because you've seen what that looks like. And I think we've got a lot of people in America who are like, yeah, we just need to, get it on. I find that most of those people have never seen combat, who have never experienced hardship, who've never experienced what it's like to be in a third world country where the infrastructure is just shot to hell because of civil strife and civil unrest. And, I was, I think it was Clay Martin who said, I wish the people who were fomenting the desire for another civil war, and I'm paraphrasing here, would step back and think a minute, because it's not going to be what you think it is. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm hopeful that that the folks who have served overseas and have dedicated a large part of their adult lives in the military, I hope they can be a real resource to these people, these other people like me who haven't, to say, guys, we fight these wars so that over there doesn't come over here, mm-hmm. right? And that's my concern, is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point.
Yeah, there's a great quote. I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, Paul, though, where Lincoln talks about never in 1,000-year trial can any army, step the country and drink from the Ohio River, whatever it was, flowery words he used. But it's very poetic. We're going to do it to ourselves. And we ultimately did. Very prophetic words for Abraham Lincoln to say. And you and I are Tennesseans. And I had family that fought on both sides of the conflict. My wife's family mostly were Confederates. We went through a long and ugly Reconstruction here in the South. I've talked about it before. My great-great-grandfather was a Unionist guerrilla behind the lines here, burning bridges in East Tennessee. And when he was ultimately captured and, died in a Confederate prison camp. I don't want that future for myself or my family. Tony references, Rich, are we up to 10? I have a 10-point system. And when it hits 10 points, I'm going to become a digital nomad with my family. We're going to hire a professional house sitter, and we're going to go sit this one out, and when America starts coming back together, I'll bounce back over here, because I'm not, if you think about what this war may look like, I'm not interested in shooting 62 grain 5.56 at anybody, another American.
That's why, and that's why I've said, I did an interview not too long ago. In fact, there's the local, it's called the Austin Chronicle, which is a left of center publication here in Austin. In fact, I was featured in an interview last week in there, and that was the point I was making, is these people who are interested in fomenting civil war, I always ask them, who are you going to shoot, and why them? Name names. Who is it you're going to shoot, right? And it's the people that are oppressing. Well, who is that, right? And this idea that all of a sudden, all these people who, I was telling a friend of mine, go walk through Walmart. And are you telling me these people in Walmart are going to sit and are fit enough and capable enough to do this? They're not. Okay. So we need to really start back, start walking this idea that we're heading towards a civil war back, because that's my concern, is that at some point, does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy just because we talk about it and because it becomes expected? Because and it's not just people in the gun community talking about it. Hell, it's in the Washington Post op-ed pages. It's in the New York Times. It's in Time magazine. I mean, your thought leaders are now talking about this openly. Well, what are people reading this stuff? What conclusions are they supposed to reach? Well, I mean, it's in the New York Times, it's in the Washington Post, it's in the LA Times.
Yeah.
I mean,
Predictive programming is a
right,
thing. I mean,
right.
it is
I
a
mean,
real
it's
thing.
people whose opinions matter are talking about this stuff, and it doesn't matter whether or not it's truth or not. It's relevant simply because it's being said, and it's being said by important people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the writing is in the wall, man. And again, people are like, oh, the zombie apocalypse, guys. The zombie apocalypse is your starving neighbor. And when they're hungry and desperate, people do dumb stuff. And Johnny King talked about that. Distribution of disaster relief goods can be dangerous. Dealing with scared and desperate people can get sporty real quick.
Absolutely.
We've seen it in Hurricane Sandy with the Red Cross and others. We've seen it in Gaza right now, the humanitarian relief that's trying to come in. We saw it in Mogadishu. We saw it in Katrina. These things have happened here. They've happened where they will happen again. It's basic human nature. But the tribalism, I love how you said it, Paul. We used to reserve this for, when Vandy come to town in Knoxville, or the Crimson
Right.
Tide would come up here and play. And that was the tribal. And that was fun and no big deal. But my God, man, when your tribalism, that it has been hijacked, that basic human tribalism has been hijacked into our two-party system, then we have a problem.
Yeah, and we've got to figure out a way to unwind ourselves from that and engage in basic civics and
Yes.
participate meaningfully. And what I find interesting is so many people who talk to me about civil unrest and civil war, and because of my job and what I do for a living, I just for fun, I ask them, I say, who is your state representative? Who is your state senator? What's the name of your mayor? They don't have a clue.
Not a clue.
They don't have a clue, but they're mad, right? Because their guy's not in the White House.
Yeah.
I mean, think about what you're saying. What's happening at the local level in your state legislatures and your city councils and your school boards, that impacts your life so much more than what happens in Washington, D.C. And yet you can't even tell me who these people are, right? So maybe the solution is to get more involved at the local level and have a voice and engage in that political process and engage in that lawmaking process rather than sitting home and storing up on 556 and water filters and live straws and whatever it is we're supposed to buy this week and whoever we're supposed to be mad at, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's a more productive use of our time.
And I 100% agree with you. But playing devil's advocate, one of the things that I see, because I know who Marshall Blackburn and all the folks that I have here in this part of Tennessee. However, I think because we've gotten to a point in our American form of government, when you have legislation about executive fiat and a new administration comes in and day one enacts 17 presidential, executive orders, and they carry the weight of law, we've gotten way beyond what we should. So in some regard, I understand when people go, well, this next election does have huge consequences because we've seen the previous administration comes in, he signs a series of executive orders, and he's completely erased all the things done by the previous administration. So I get it when people get really, heated about the next administration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And a lot of that is a function of the solution is to restore the three branches of government, right?
Mm-hmm.
That
Yes.
we keep each branch of government stays in its lane. That you don't have, and I've read Supreme Court opinions, and if you no one ever reads the opinion, right? They just say, well, the court said this and now I'm mad, or the court said this and now I'm happy. They never read the opinion. If you actually spend time reading their opinions, particularly some of the dissents, you will see language where they say, this really is Congress's job. You really don't want us, the Supreme Court, answering this question.
Correct.
And we're being asked to answer this question because Congress will not do its job. And, so you've got at least some people pointing this out, that we really do need three branches of government, and we need people to stay in their lanes. So the solution is clear, right? The solution is just follow the damn Constitution. That's
Amen.
all you got to do.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, my guy gets in, my guy gets elected. He undoes all the things through executive order that your guy did that I didn't like, and we cheer that, and we think, but you're just piling on. I mean, you're using the solution you didn't like previously now to fix the problem. And I mean, that's where this, when my guy does it, it's okay. But when your guy does it, it's wrong. We've got to get away from this and be able to start calling balls and strikes. And when my guy does something that's wrong, I need the courage to say, no, that's not how we should do things. We should follow the process outlined in the Constitution.
100%. Let's get some comments here. Tony talks about professional influencers. I saw this morning where Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, has finally come out and said this. We've been infiltrated. Welcome to the party there, Eric. Derek says a lot of those advocating for civil war would have a heart attack sprinting for cover. Well said. Tony asked a question, but I want to come back to that. He says, so what's the alternative to government weaponization? We'll come back to that. But Johnny King says, the hope I had in war was to get home to my family. Imagine not having that hope because your country is the war zone. Wow, very poignant, sir. Tony talks about administrative oligarchy. Don says corporate and lobbying money have completely corrupted the system. Ooh, Paul, as a professional lobbyist, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I get that, and I obviously hear that a lot. The reality is that these people have to run for re-election, and at some point, when people show up and turn these people out, that's what gets their attention. And yes, they're obviously, I have lobby funds. I spend lobby funds. We do as an organization. At the same time, I will tell you, people get worried about the NRA and big business. If you go look and see who's spending the money, it's not big businesses. It's unions. It's the teachers unions. It's the Teamsters. Those folks have far more money than the corporations do. The reality is this, is that until people get involved in the process and start letting their legislators know, start showing up at their district offices, not in Washington, show up at their district offices to complain, that's what gets legislators' attention. And to the extent that you can become an influencer in your own community, that's what gets people's attention. It's the small businessman, small businesswoman. It's the person who's engaged, the president of the Rotary Club. Those are the people who really move the needle in these elections, believe it or not, because I can point to numerous examples of where candidates got outspent by with lobbyist money who lost elections simply because they lost the support of the people in their district.
That's such a great point you make, and I think it's often overlooked. And I didn't have that light bulb moment until I heard some congressional representative being interviewed on one of those programs, and he said, "Oh, this is a big deal." You know, I woke up this morning to 8 phone calls from my constituents back home in Oklahoma, Texas, wherever. I mean, 8 phone calls is huge. So I'm like, that's all it took, you know. And your district. Yeah. Your district has hundreds of thousands of people in it. 8 phone calls got you to move the needle. I mean, so it doesn't take much, to Paul's point.
To build a relationship with these people. That's what I tell people all the time is build a relationship with your state legislator, with your city council person. You don't have to agree with them. You may not even have voted for that person, but they appreciate people, thoughtful people who are paying attention, who reach out to them and say, I think you should be mindful of X, Y, and Z, because you may be the only person pointing that out. And if they get 5 or 6 people raising that question, then, you know, the people, you know, government goes to the people who show up, right? Yes. And if only a handful of people register their votes or register their concerns, that's going to carry a lot of weight, disproportionate to the number of people in their district.
Paul, we're coming up on our time here, so I want to use the last 2 questions very quickly here. Number one, what can the average armed citizens do to make themselves harder to kill? And finally, if there are some of your favorite books relative to this preparedness topic, I know you mentioned Ted Koppel's amazing book, Lights Out, hands down, encourage that. Are there any other books or things that people can do to keep themselves safer that perhaps we haven't talked about?
So we'll answer your first question about how to be harder to kill. One of the things I'm really fond of stressing is learning first aid, TAC medicine. My good friend Caleb Causey at Lone Star Medics teaches a lot of courses. It was because I was taking some of his courses that I decided to become an EMT. So I have an EMT certification in large part because I want to be a resource to myself and to my family. So one, being able to treat wounds, being able to treat issues that come up because of kinetic engagement, that's important. Also, just being able to avoid things, right? And that's why we talk about drones. That's why we talk about communication systems, so that we can avoid and not put ourselves into places where things happen. You know, I go to Tom Gibbons' tactical conference from time to time, and what always impresses upon me are guys like you who have done this for a living, who are trainers, who are cops, who've done this, who've been in the business of violence all their lives, who are big guys who work out a lot, and they are the first person to tell you, man, I I don't pump gas at night, right? I mean, and
Mm.
these are bad dudes. These are dudes who have real solid skills and are really good. And they are some of the most cautious people in terms of not going to stupid places at stupid time with stupid people, right? To avoid, so much of it is avoidance, and B, being able to deal with the aftermath. And so the other piece of this is being harder to kill. It's not just about being harder to kill. It's being able to survive the legal aftermath. And I guess it's just the lawyer in me coming out. I wrote a paper, did a presentation for the State Bar of Texas not too long ago about these self-defense insurance programs, liability programs, and being able to make sure that you pick one or pick ones. I'm subscribed to 3 of them because I need to make sure that I've got quote unquote full coverage because I live in Austin, where I know that if I defend myself, I'm going to get run through the ringer. I know it's Texas, but in some of these larger cities, you should expect a lot of scrutiny. So, avoid dangerous places, be able to care for yourself immediately, be able to survive the legal aftermath. So that was the answer to your first question. Second question, books. Lots of good material out there. Fellow Tennessean, MD Creekmore, has written some good books out there. And his books are really simple to read. And they're really concrete. Do this, do that. I appreciate that. I mentioned some of the stuff from Clay Martin. He's putting out some good stuff. Don Shift is putting out some really good stuff as of late. I've got several of his books. And some I haven't even gotten to read yet. Just I buy that's a great idea. And of course, Pivot Points on Amazon. That's my book. I always recommend you buy Pivot Points. It's not, and I want to be clear, this is not a how-to book on getting yourself prepared. It is really for those of you who are serious about preparedness and students of preparedness and wanting to encourage other people to get prepared. That's what that book's about. And I hope it's been fun to write that book. It's been fun. I've made a lot of friends as a result of that. People I would never have been able to connect with simply by the fact I've got a book on Amazon. And so I've always appreciated the friends I've made and the connections I've made as a result of that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on today, Paul. PaulTMartin.com. Again, if you can't pick up the book on Amazon, you don't have the resources, guys, he has some free, downloadable, actionable. Okay. It's not entertainment. It's just actionable information that's going to take you and your family to the next level when it comes to preparedness. Paul, thank you so much for coming on today, sir.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
It's been a lot of fun. Maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
All right, guys and gals out there, Warrior Nation, stay safe because the fight is coming. Be ready.